So next we have a panel around the physical risks of climate change. Yeah. So we're going to invite our panelists up and our moderator, Luc van der Boom. So we have Jos, come on up. Guys, come on up.
Yeah, thank you for joining the panel. First of all, this will be the first panel of today. The second one will be after the break, and this is, like Andrea said, about physical climate risk. As you just heard from Sarah in her introduction to climate change, the building environment accounts for like 40% of the emissions worldwide. And ironically enough, the physical risks that come with climate change. As you see today, my apartment this morning was 32 degrees Celsius. So I was glad we are hosted by EY with an air conditioning. And I think I'm really proud that we can present like 4 experts on climate change, on the research part, but all the way up to like more the real estate, like how do you actually consult and advise real estate investors on their way to actually acquire property that is mitigating that risk. So I first want to introduce everyone. We've got Maurits working for EY as a senior climate change and sustainability consultant. Leonie, all the way from Paris. She just made it on time due to the...
More or less, yeah.
More or less.
I'm one of the people who came by train and was delayed.
Exactly. Better than by plane, otherwise you were still in Paris, yeah. Probably. We've got Lucy, not from London, she's based in Amsterdam but works for Hillbreak. And then we've got Jos from Cushman & Wakefield, senior research consultant. I first want to, just the panel, we want to do like a 5-minute introduction from everyone, have a 10-minute discussion around the topics, and then we just want to ask the crowd or the public to ask questions in a Q&A. So just when you hear the discussion, please write down your questions or keep them in mind. So I want to start with Maurits. So can you tell a bit more about your daily work and how you deal with climate change and how you advise your clients?
Yeah, I will. Thank you for inviting me here. My name is Maurits Heldering. I work for EY. Actually, I've been an equity analyst for almost 20 years, and at some stage I got a big stock in my career, and I decided to leave my previous employer, ABN AMRO, and then I thought, what is it I want to do now? And I thought, yeah, the subject I think is most important is climate change, so I want to find a job in climate change. So I did a lot of interviews with investors, with consultancy firms, also with one of the boutiques here on the right side of my hand, and ultimately ended up at EY. Here I'm in the climate change and sustainability team, and primarily what we do is help companies with our climate reporting. So we give assurance on how they report on that, we advise where they can improve their reporting, but in a broader sense we also can advise them on other climate change related subjects. But the reporting part is the thing that is most worth mentioning today, because that's where I'll focus on in the discussions here.
Perfect, thank you. Leonie?
Thanks to me. So hi, I'm Leonie Chatin. I'm a climate risk analyst at 427, so I don't know if you know about us, but we are data provider of data on the impact of climate change for financial institutions. So we are based in Berkeley and we have offices in Paris, as you may have guessed, I'm from Paris, and also in Japan and in Washington. And so what we do is that we take the climate data and the climate sciences and we translate it into indicators that are easy to understand for people like you and me that are not scientists. So that's basically what we do, and we try with that to give the tool so that climate change data is integrated into decision-making processes to foster climate adaptation in general.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I've been here for about 7 months, as in Amsterdam. I work as a consultant for a called Hillbreak, and we specialise in ESG and responsible investment advice. We also provide training as well to the real estate sector on sustainability and vice versa, sustainability professionals trying to enter into this world.
Perfect, thanks.
Well, my name is Jos Hesselink, and I work at the research department at Cushman & Wakefield, a real estate service provider. at the research department, we collect primarily a whole bunch of data on office and industrial and retail occupier transaction data, as well as investment data. And we collect these, we enrich this, for example, on energy labels of the different buildings. And within this role, we communicate, we research the data, and we advise, real estate advisors, but also occupiers on their housing strategies.
Perfect, thanks. And I think for like your reference, I think the news just came out this week.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No worries, but Moody's actually acquired a huge stake in
I'm not used to
427.
saying it, but yeah.
But congrats on that. And I think that also like shows that financial institutions are actually really getting into researching and acquiring that data from, for example, 427. But there was also other news.
Thank you for...
Oh, no worries. But I think it's good to mention, and it's great news for you to expand. So we want to kick off actually also with you. So we will stay with Leonie with the first question from...
Yeah, I was going to say, should I move?
I think...
Oh, no, just we said... No worries. No, I will just ask some questions, and then we will go in depth and just go through.
Yes.
And if you have something to say, just add it to the discussion. Also, the crowd, if you feel free to join in. But Leonie, like from your research and your knowledge, because before you worked at 427, you already...
I'm still working at 427.
Yeah.
We are still called 427, yeah.
Yeah, but before, you also were
working,
engaged into sustainability, of course. But what are from your perspective and from your research, what are the most pressing climate risks you encounter now in the data you're transforming and explaining to your clients?
In the world in general?
Yeah, in the world. Maybe you can start with that, and after that on the Dutch market.
I'm not going to choose one big hazard that is going to happen because I have no good news. Everything is going to happen at the same time, more or less. So what we analyzed is the risk of floods, the risk of sea level rise, of heat stress, water stress, and I'm forgetting one, cyclones. And we'll soon also have an indicator about wildfires. And so what does it mean for the world is that the place is just a really general idea, but you can have this idea that the places that are really wet right now are going to get wetter, and the ones that are really dry right now are going to get drier. More or less, that's the global idea. And so what does it mean for real estate? And then, I have my slide here. I just put this table from a report from Heitmine and the Urban Land Institute, which wrote something about climate risk and real estate investment decision making. So how climate change is understood and how is it integrated by the industry you are all in. And so they have this nice table that I like on the potential impact of climate change for real estate. So just quickly, what is summarized that you can be affected both on the fact that your building can be damaged, you can have costs to repair it, but also to maintain it because it's going to be hotter, the soil are going to change, and maybe some cracks are going to happen in the wall, things like that. And then you can also have additional costs for adaptation. Most of you are Dutch, and you are supposed to be really good at that. So you will supposed to adapt and build new infrastructures, and so that's a lot of capital expenditures. And then you have, and that's not in this table, but that's also really important, the cost of not the climate risk in itself, but the cost of the perception of climate risk by the other one. And we are already seeing in Germany, in the US, and in Finland, there has study in Finland showing that the residential market is actually moving, and the places that have the most risk are actually losing value. So that's another really important point to have in mind when you're thinking about the impact of climate change on real estate. And I had another slide. I wanted to go more deeply into the Dutch case. I think it's not going to be a surprise for you, but your main issue is flooding, both because of sea level rise and of the increase in frequency and in intensity of extreme precipitation. So here I just wanting to give you an example of what our data say, and you have the case of a building in the south of the Netherlands, and what you are seeing is the risk of floods. So the two, I'm not sure everyone can see it, but what we are looking on the two indicator below is a site in a flooding area or not. So we just put it on the side for now. And the three other ones are about the change in intensity and frequency of extreme precipitation. So what this says is that we are looking here at the decade 2030, 2040, that you're going to have almost 2 additional risks of extreme precipitation events in this decade I was mentioning, and that those events are going to be worse by 50%. That's just to get an idea of how precise we can be, and that for most of you maybe it doesn't mean anything, and so we have these nice indicators from 0 to 100 to tell you if it's 100, it's really bad, and if it's 0, you're okay. So that's the main idea, yeah.
And so I was wondering, Maurits, if you see all these risks, are these typical things the companies are asking you to report on or to assess, or is it still too far away for?
Well, I think what we can say is that a lot of companies are still in the early changes to report on physical risks at all. We see that many companies have been reporting about our transition risks. Mm-hmm. But physical risk is like early days in terms of reporting. But we do see that at least companies operating in the Netherlands mention these types of risks as well. There's also one risk that you haven't mentioned, what I read in a report of the Association of Insurers here in the Netherlands. And that's they expect a substantial increase in damages from hail.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that impacts the real estate sector. Obviously, it has an impact on cars and greenhouses and solar panels. Is that also a factor you do research on the hail specifically?
Not for now, because it's so specific to some places.
Yeah.
And we are trying to have a global coverage, and it's like climate models are not really good at capturing a single event, such as cyclone or hail. So we don't have the data for that. I think it could be interesting. So, yeah, I have no precise answer, but I know that in France, in my town, we had one big hailstorm lately, and it actually destroyed the windows from houses.
From houses,
yeah.
okay. And from offices as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there is also a case in Mexico just months ago of the whole city being just under the. Mm-hmm. It's quite impressive.
It's
pretty
bad.
Yeah, I think from your time also at Grosvenor, Lucy. Lucy worked at Grosvenor before she worked at Hilbrey.
Yeah.
Just more from the investor perspective, did you, when you worked there on the living city concept, did you actually account for those risks as well, or was it?
Yeah, they were definitely maturing their thinking around physical climate risk amongst other trends as well that were affecting cities. They looked at it through the lens of resilience. So you guys might be familiar with Arup's work on that as well, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And they were considering what were the different sort of vulnerability and adaptive capacity of different cities that they were already invested in, or maybe that they were interested in investing in the future. So they weren't integrating it necessarily into their strategic plans or the reporting yet, but they were definitely starting to think about that. But this was back in 2014, and so now I've not been with Grosvenor for almost a year, but I know that their thinking and how they're trying to consider that within their sort of forward-thinking planning is definitely progressed, should I say, from that point, which I think is quite similar across the board.
Especially because they're in there for the long term.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Family.
So that makes them, quite unique in that sense, because, they're holding their assets. But they always worried about that, because long term means different things to different people, but they were just depending on which particular operating company you were talking about, but it was about 100 years or so, and plus, more so.
Yeah, that's also what I want to ask Jos. During lunch we talked about the investors that mainly are investing for the short term, or as long as there's they get money out of it. Mm-hmm. How do you see that? Is it evolving that they are actually questioning what the risks are and mitigating that risk, or are they still in it for, in the end, the money, of course? But
yeah, basically it is that. It is getting more important, but in my humble observation, it is that climate change, sustainability is one of the factors investors are assessing when to purchase a property or not. I think, well, economy, cyclical, but also structural, is the main part of it. So they're not only capitalizing on the existing rent, which still comes out of the building. So they're also thinking on, okay, what if the lease ends? Will the building still be attractive for future tenants? So they're looking at the location of the building. They're looking at the specific of a specific region. Is the regional economy growing? Does it has a lot of companies with growth potential, etc., etc. And although sustainability, durability is a thing people find very important, that is underwritten everywhere, I think that it is one of the risks that they assess, but that's not particularly the most important one, especially there in the region of Eindhoven. Eindhoven is seeing a remarkable revival in creative and technological industries. It is very hot in terms of economic boom at the moment. Investors are aligning there. So the fact that this city yesterday broke the all-time high temperature record will not particularly make them go away. That is also.
Yeah, that's the reality in the end. Okay. But then I want to go back to Leonie, I guess.
Yeah.
From your research from last year you did with Geofy,
Yeah.
you do show, like in your data, that there's a lot of risk when it comes down to, okay, that was on the listed companies.
Yeah, just before going back to what you were saying, you're right, but at the same time, if it's heat, it's okay. If it's floods, then it gets complicated. And it doesn't mean that they are going to leave this place, but maybe they have to spend money to adapt to it. And that's maybe something they should consider.
Yes, that's very true, of course. But then I think it does depend whether a location is protected by flooding. And yeah, we are in fact a floodplain of the Rhine River, but it is quite welded in concrete, and we're supported with. And I think the flood risk is limited. We have calculations about we constructed our dikes to withhold most floods in every 1,000 years. We thought it was an acceptable risk, but that's an entirely different problem of the floodplains in, for example, Bangladesh, which is very an emerging economy, or, for example, Florida. So the flooding risk is there, but it is contained. So you know, in the midst of all the other risk factors, investors are, to my best, they're more focusing on is the building future-proof on all the different variables.
I suppose as well as what they've got, I suppose, direct or indirect control over, whereas some of climate adaptation work is much more at a city level, isn't it? Yeah. And that's a whole new way of thinking, like working with partnerships and collaboratively, which is definitely going to be.
Yeah, that's one of the conclusions of the Heitman report, is go and talk to the local authorities to actually do something about it.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer of government control and regulations on this topic, especially with construction laws in the Netherlands. There are specific guidelines being formalized, put into law, and that's the reality, and you have to make it work. Yeah. If they don't have to, they don't do. That's also the reality.
They mostly use historical data that I know of, and they don't. Most of the time they do their calculation out of historical data, and they do not include climate change. But that's another issue.
Can you
elaborate?
Yeah.
So when they do the regulation saying you have to build something, and when the local authority in the Netherlands try to build an infrastructure, I think they are now trying to integrate climate change. But yes, you are protected, but with data that come from the past. not with the projection of what's going to happen. And I'm sure
that's very
they are working to integrate these two and to see if they are still it's still accurate for new conditions per changing climate. But yeah.
But for example, we are just coming from this period from the early 2000s until now, where we were faced with huge oversupply in office buildings in the Netherlands because of this unregulated office development boom, causing very high structural vacancy levels. Well, now because of transformation, repurposing to other functions, it is decreasing. But still, it is very much. You see that current investors are much more aware of the dangers lying in over developing and vacancy, for example, especially in regions where a population might decrease or economy might not be on the early phase of the product life cycle. So these factors are much more. They are causing much more worries. So I think that a national government, a national body, preferably a European body, should really make a thing in the sand and say this is the red line. And
I want to hear the opinion from Maurits, because of course EY is responsible for financial assurance of data, and now more and more going into climate data. How do you see that evolving? Is there like a combination between it, or are you mixing it up? Like, okay, when the climate changes, that also has an effect on the financial?
I mean, climate data are often put in the non-financial information data. So data that would not be financially important. I totally disagree. I think climate risk is a financial risk. So therefore, actually, I think it shouldn't be in sustainability reporting. It shouldn't be among diversity reporting or reporting on other things. It's an isolated financial risk, I think. I think it's a risk that is underestimated. When I hear you, I think, a lot of investors are, especially also in real estate, are underestimating that risk. Also because it's not linear. As you say, historical data may give you comfort, but the question is what's going to happen if we got 3 or 4 degrees warming. So I think it's definitely a very important topic. And if you can pull up one of these slides, because there I can show how companies report differently on it. This is a slide with some of the large European real estate companies. I also put some Dutch companies in the list. First of all, what we see in terms of TCFD, that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, we see that only 2 European real estate companies are TCFD supporters. Of those 2 European real estate companies, those 2 are in the UK. So there's no continental European real estate company. Maybe there's an exception. That's a TCFD supporter. Also what we see is huge differences in terms of the quality of the reporting. Here I have a column with the types of physical risks that are mentioned. Flooding, storms, wildfires, snow was even mentioned as a physical risk by Clapierre, I think. Extreme temperatures. What strikes me especially is that some of the Dutch players are not reporting anything at all on the physical front. So if I look at the annual reports of Fastnet or NSE, Euro Commercial Properties, they don't mention the word climate at all. So, and that's, I think, a bit, the area where you were talking about. Our clients, investors may not be interested. But I would say look at the best-in-class players, like Landsec. They have got a 30-page report on all kind of climate statistics, not just CO2 emissions, but also flooding risk data, number of square meters that is at risk of flooding. I think that's the way it will go, because investors, basically as an investor, you want to know the risks. And I know you're right, there are lots of risks, but I think this is going to be a strongly emerging risk. It's underestimated. And that's why we need, I think, companies to report much more on it.
And even though they're not reporting yet, the people are starting to prepare, I think, definitely towards TCFD more and more, and considering using climate scenario analysis and doing that thinking, I think is definitely starting to change the conversations, at least in the boardroom anyway.
But I missed. Yeah, a quick side note: these are the listed real estate companies.
Yeah.
And ASR, I see, waving.
We started.
Okay, started.
Okay.
Okay.
Congrats.
Yeah.
Before.
What I think is a strange thing is that we start with the reporting part on climate risk and not the acting part, because at ASR we're starting with, okay, how should we report about this? And I totally agree with you that the acting part is, we have to start from the bottom. And I discussed this topic today with my technical colleagues, and they told me, well, yeah, we can start with this, but we have to be, well, every year we do a check on our real estate, and then we check if there are any, well, climate change relating risks, and then if the check is okay, then it's fine and we go on, and then we report on this. But what is the difference?
No, reporting is just a start, I think. You know, it's a start to know where are the risks, what are the risks, who faces the risks, and when you know that, you can start acting as an investor by selling or buying different real estate companies.
That's a different part.
But as a real estate company, you can start acting as of today. You don't have to do the reporting. But you know, so the question is, where's the responsibility? Is the responsibility of the government? Is the responsibility of the investor? Is the responsibility of the company? I think of all of them, but as a company, you can start today. You don't have to wait for...
I want to ask Lucy, when clients come to Hillbreak, what do you typically hear as a...
At the moment, generally, it's probably investor-led, like that's the main driver. But I think going forward with like changes coming with legislation in the UK, for example, with the UK Green Finance Strategy, I think that's going to be a bit of a sea change, and seeing more and more companies, like you said, not just preparing, but also demonstrating that they're reporting with TCFD guidelines in mind. We're seeing people that are already, our clients are already reviewing their reporting against the TCFD recommendations. So they want to move from I suppose, a non-acting position to one that's a bit more active in the future. But yeah, I would say that's where they're...
Do your clients typically start with reporting? Like
they're reviewing, they're not changing their reporting, but they're looking at their reporting as it is, and then they're looking at sort of how they can adapt and change and incorporate thinking and the sort of knowledge that is now available.
Yeah.
But I can talk about like our clients, they begin with reporting.
Yeah.
We also do equity, and that's really, but that's because you, like he was saying, you have to know the risk, and that's the first step, and that's the easiest one to begin with also. So
Yeah.
I think you see it in, there's some GRASP people here. You see it in the GRASP data as well. Like the policies are first like executed, and then afterwards the implementation starts. So I think it's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, and just definitely running the analysis as well. I think that's the first step as well.
I want to quickly go back to Leonie on your like really interesting research.
yeah,
because
sorry, I changed.
Yeah, we
were asking about our analysis with Geophy. So, and I'm gonna go back to what we were saying when talking about that. But so we did an analysis of REITs exposure all around the world. So we partnered with Geophy, which is a data provider, and they gave us the exact location of every properties in 321 REITs portfolio. And so we were able to map them for 3 of our indicators: sea level rise, cyclones, and floods. And so we were able to give this kind of visual. Stand up. So here you have each dot represents a REIT, and the size of the dot represents the REIT value. Sadly, we didn't have the value of the property, but we still had the one of the REIT. And so that's why I'm gonna go back to what you were saying. But when you look at that, basically here is Asia, in the red, right, and on the bottom. So yes, they are the one with the highest risk. Like they are exposed to cyclone. In that you have REITs in Japan representing, I think, a total value of more than $200 billion, if I'm not wrong. So that's huge, and that's a lot of value at risk. But then I was looking at the Dutch REITs, and I have the one that were in your list before, and they are here. That's ring a bell to what we were telling earlier, like, okay, the risk is coming from the other country, that's not from us. I want just to change the sentence and say, no, they are really, really, really exposed. We are still exposed. because here, what this means is that they still have, there are 3 of them, and they still have between 19 and 34% of their properties exposed to flood. So that's still a lot of risk. And if we just change the slide, I put some geographical representation of the risk, and you can see, so that each point represents a property in the 3 REITs portfolio, and the color represents the flood risk of flood. And you can see that most of it comes from the Netherlands, but also in France and a little bit in Milan. Yeah. So yeah, don't think that the risk comes from somewhere else. It's also where we are living, actually.
And this is just for the next 10 to 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And then, but
Yeah.
we're not able to model yet what's going on.
Not for now. So what we focused on at 427 is the risk for the decade 2030, 2040, because it's the easiest way to think about it, because while we already emitted in the past, greenhouses emission is going to have an impact in that decade if we change the policy or if we don't. We have so much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we know that the impact are going to be huge, and the scenario analysis only matter after 2050, more or less. Before that, we know we're going to have issues, and if we all turn green tomorrow, that's not going to change. That's the big message of that.
But if we don't after 2050.
And if we don't, that's, we're actually going to have the data with scenario analysis, and we're going to be able to see the difference, and I'm really afraid of the scientific team telling me the results.
So I had a lot of other questions, but I think hopefully there are a lot of questions in your head, and if you don't have them, I have enough. But yes, please.
So my name is Ingmar Schuurmans. I represent South Pole, a Swiss climate data consultant, and I'm very interested in. We're focused here on the asset class, real estate, of course. Where is the biggest limitation in terms of data availability, according to you, or specifically Leonie?
Data in terms of business data or climate data, you would say?
Data in
both. Well, when you talk about real estate, as we just look, so we don't do resilience evaluation. We don't look at the adaptation side. So this is a big missing point, but we just don't deal with it. We just are analyzing the exposure of the location the building is in. And I think the other part of it, looking at, but is a building I don't know, does it have flood protection around it? All this kind of really tiny information, really hard to get, would be something that we would really need to have a better view of the risk. Is a building made of, I don't know which materials that absorb less heat, things like that. So I think that would be the main gap. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Rick?
Yes, so my name is Rick Recour. I work at GRASP as an associate. I actually have a question for Leonie as well, but also for the wider panel. What I hear quite some insurers say is that one of the biggest risk for real estate investors is actually that their insurance contract won't be renewed. And that's a significant risk because insurers can usually roll over the contracts annually. And their assessment largely determines upon ESG or climate risk characteristics, but I understand it can also, so the interest rate that is being set, so financial considerations are also important. So how, A, do you agree on that perspective, that that's a big risk for real estate investors? And B, how would you recommend real estate investors stay ahead of insurance policy changes?
So A, yes. It was in the table, I forgot to mention that. But yeah, we have, as I was saying, we are based in California. And because of the last wildfire, there are places that are non-insurable anymore. And they are saying that a 4-degree world would not be insurable. And so this is not seen in, we don't see in Europe yet. But yeah, there will be a change of cost and of coverage because of climate change, that's for sure. And if I have advice is adapt and prove your insurance that even if you have this kind of trouble, you're going to be able to manage and to get out, still standing here. So yeah, so that's why we need to develop then tools to show, okay, you are exposed, but are you prepared to leave this exposure more or less?
But that also has an effect on the value of the property, and that's also one more question for Jos. It's like, do you see as a failure? You're not a failure, but of course at Cushman & Wakefield there are failures. Do you see like a change in that there are more and more looking into like the sustainability part of it and mitigating climate risk in the value of the property?
So Luc has asked me this question beforehand. So I asked our appraisers on the different sections of the company what was their view on this question, and it was quite disappointing. Actually, the guys from retail said, yeah, well, probably covered shopping centers will be much more attractive for future owners because the shopping conditions can be regulated there, regardless whether they're below sea level, which is 1/3 of our country. The guys from residential, they actually didn't know at all. So they just follow national regulations, which are quite tough. And of course, the office guys, they have their mandatory regulations already being in place. So they knew quite well actually what to do and how to and how to cover needed investments in office buildings to match the obligations laid down by the government in 2023.
So you more or less say the regulators should actually act and push the boundaries of
yeah,
how to determine the
and
value.
I don't want to, I don't want to give this picture of, yeah, the government should do anything and we're not to blame, because that's absolutely not the thing I would like to say. The thing is, within retail is properties. Well, everything in retail land is on fire at the moment. E-commerce is slashing through shopping centers. Is really impacting in the social lives of people. So appraisers are much more assessing the risks whether a retail outlet will be refilled in the foreseeable future. And as far as I can see, is the only problem here is with assessing the value is when you have this your triple net lease, who is doing the necessary investments to go to a grade label in 2023.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because it's like whether or not people being rewarded yet for climate adaptation work, essentially. Obviously, people are relying a lot on insurance at the moment to cover damages, but because they're not seeing any sort of necessary immediate financial value from integrating climate adaptation, I think it's a bit of a against like the other risks that you're seeing, which have got immediate returns, and I think that's the challenge that we face.
Maurits?
Yeah, maybe you can pull my last slide up on this subject, because I think regulators are doing something in this space. The Bank of England is.
Yeah.
And quite substantially, I think. This is, the Bank of England has done a stress test for insurers this year. And for the first time, they've included climate risks. So they say to insurers, okay, look at the energy companies you have in your portfolio. You take two scenarios, either an orderly transition or a disorderly transition. And in one case, the equity value goes down by 15%, and in the other case by 40%. Everybody understands that, that's energy, we know that. But now we go down the slide and we look at real estate. And what do we see there? The Bank of England has said to the insurers, you do a stress test, two scenarios again, orderly transition, disorderly transition. For the properties affected by physical risks, you deduct 30% of the value. For the properties not affected by physical risk, you can add 10% of the value. So this is what the Bank of England says to insurers to apply in their calculations. So this is your point of rewarding companies that are doing like adaptation. So yeah, the Bank of England is the first in this respect, and I don't think they will be the last. So I think this is the way the regulators will go. I think other central banks will also increasingly ask investors and the assets behind the investors, so also the real estate assets, how is the exposure? And this one, yeah, I think was really striking. Minus 30% in an extreme case for real estate. It's not something I would have expected, at least.
Yeah, people will think twice when they invest in real estate when they see this. Unfortunately, that was the time for the panel, so we have to leave it with this. Thanks for the interesting insights. If you have any other questions to the panelists after the session or in the break, they will be there, and please ask them your questions. Thanks.